One way that we can establish the significance of fake news as a topic is to consider how it takes up some of the issues that have been interesting historians for quite some time. And what we find if we look at the work of history over the last century or so is that the question of fake news relates in interesting ways to the question of how historical truth is found and established. Because what we find when we look at how historians talk about their art is that the relationship between facts and truth isn't as straightforward as we might imagine it to be. And let's start off with the question of how we establish historical facts. On a certain level, historians would all agree that history has to be about things that really did happen. But the problem is that history is about more than that. And as history is developed as a discipline, the role of media in clarifying the differences between things that happen and things that count as historical truth has become really, really important. And to begin to get a grasp on this, we can consider the image that you see before you, which is one of the most famous and controversial images from war photography ever taken by one of the history's leading exponents of the art of war photography, Robert Capa. And this is a image that's popularly known as the Falling Soldier that was taken in 1936 during the Spanish Civil War. Now, I've given you a reference to Wikipedia here, and I'm normally a little bit cautious about using Wikipedia, but what Wikipedia is good at in terms of this particular image is it is very good at outlining the reasons why we can see this image as being controversial because it's not entirely sure what it represents. One of the reasons why this image became so famous was because what it purports to represent is a Spanish is a participant in the Spanish Civil War at the moment that he is killed by a sniper. But if we go to the Wikipedia entry, what we find is there are a series of stories around this image, what it's actually of, how it was taken, that really make us doubt this image. The story from Robert Capa himself was that he was cowering down in a trench during a battle in the Spanish Civil War and was simply holding his camera above the parapet of the trench and clicking away, hoping that he captured something. And really, quite by chance, happened to capture this soldier at the moment in which he was killed. And this is seen as being a particularly poignant image of the tragedy of war. So there's a few things. We see that the image is something that's meaningful, not simply of what it is, but because how it's fitted into a narrative of the tragedy of war. But what we also find is that this image is controversial because there are a range of other stories about what the image actually captured. There were allegations that the picture was not taken during the battle that Capa suggested it was taken at. There were allegations that this is a soldier who's simply tripping and falling over. He's not being shot. There were questions about whether he was being shot by a sniper or hit by machine gun fire. There are a range of questions that we can ask about this image, which means that what the image ultimately does, the one thing we can say without any doubt really, is that it captures the space between facts and historical truth. This is an image that was taken during the Spanish Civil War of a participant in that civil war, but what it actually represents is we're less clear, and the meaning of this image doesn't just depend on what we see in front of us, what we see with our own eyes, the evidence of our own eyes, but also on the stories that we place around it. Now, this takes us into deeper debates about the relationship between facts and history. And one of the things that we can do is to talk about this in relation to the work of a famous historian called Eric Hobsbawm on invented traditions. Now, Hobsbawm um, talked about invented traditions in his book, co-edited with Ranger. But what this was part of was a much longer tradition of work by Eric Hobsbawm, very interesting historian, born in what went on to become the Czech Republic in the 1920s, part of a Jewish family. Flees Nazi occupation, comes to the United Kingdom, fights during World War II, but then becomes one of the preeminent British historians of the post-war period, and does a lot of research on what history is. And he's kind of got a few ideas that were also discussed elsewhere by people like Eric, by E.H. Carr. About the relationship between history and facts. So Hobsbawm was convinced that history has to be based on facts. You can't just make history up. History has to be based on things that really happened. However, the problem is that it is never clear what the facts of history are. What this means is the job of the historian isn't simply to write down all the facts that she can find about a particular event. History inevitably involves sorting and creating hierarchies of facts and also interpreting what those facts are. So things happen, but why they happen, why they're important, how they are related is a matter that needs investigation and interpretation. And one of the things that keeps history alive as a discipline is the fact that we can argue about the facts of history. We can argue about why things happen, whether things happen, and what they mean. And this was seen by Carr not as a matter of purely academic interest to historians, but actually something that was a matter of national importance. Because he talked about the fact that national cultures are very much based on the stories that we tell about the historical facts that we choose to present to the public as being important. And this was what Carr meant by the notion of the invented tradition. What he argued was that national cultures become national cultures by selecting and connecting facts about the past in a way that is non-necessary. My favourite example that he gives is of the relationship between Scottish national identity and kilts. If I say Scotland, probably one of the first images that that comes into your mind is the image of a person wearing a kilt. And the interesting thing that Hobsbawm says about kilts is kilts were never an image of Scottish national identity until the Scots decided that they were going to be an image of national identity. The sorts of kilts that we see people wearing today and the sorts of ideas that those kilts evoke about Scottish national identity were deliberate inventions. That is, there was a time in Scottish culture where people decided, more or less, that Scotland needed a national image and a national symbol, and they decided that the kilt was going to be that. And so, in a way, it is true that the kilt is an image of Scottish national identity, but that truth didn't really happen until someone somewhere decided that that was what the kilt was going to be. So the kilt existed, but what the kilt meant was a matter of invention. And what kilts therefore became was also something that was a matter of invention. Now, we can also see how that happens in Australia around the idea of the Anzac Myth. Now, again, when I'm talking about a myth, I'm not talking about something that's not true. I'm talking about a political idea that has been subject to work. So we know, for example, that Australian national identity is closely related to ideas about what happened on the beaches of Gallipoli. That during the Gallipoli campaign, which was fought significantly by troops from Australia and New Zealand, there is the idea that that forged a particular identity and relationship between troops from Australia and New Zealand that forever changed how the rest of the world regarded Australia and New Zealand, and forever changed how Australia and New Zealand regarded itself. So the argument is that in some ways Australia was born on the beach of Gallipoli. Now, of course, there were significant numbers of Australian and New Zealand troops at Gallipoli, but the idea that this became a representation of everything that's good and true about Australia and New Zealand, again, was the subject of work. That's partly true because we have decided to focus on Gallipoli as a founding story. We pay a lot of attention to that story. And therefore, it becomes part of our story about who we as Australians and New Zealanders are. And in that sense, is an invented tradition. Gallipoli was a fact, but the fact that Gallipoli is seen as the birth of a nation, for want of a better phrase, is not. So again, we have this kind of there's a relationship between facts and truth, but the two are not the same thing. So what we can say is that the question of fake news is related to broader questions in history for a number of things. So historians would say the following things about facts. Facts matter, but historians order facts into narratives. That means selecting and amplifying some facts over others. And as we go forward, we're going to see this notion of the amplified fact as something that's really important to notions of fake news. Historians agree that sometimes their work has been overly influenced by present-day political questions. So historians are quite often critical of themselves about the fact that they're quite often focusing on explaining the past as a kind of a gateway to the present, which is not really the same thing as recreating the past as it was. But one thing we can say is that history, facts, and the relationship between facts and stories is important because nations need invented traditions. And we know this because every nation has its own invented tradition, a national myth that performs a function in society, normally a function of cohesion. And this is true of all societies. Here's an image from North Korea representing the Kim family as the patriarchs of everything that's good and true in North Korea. But this is not simply an authoritarian device. We can also talk about the myth of JFK, the idea that JFK embodied something that was eternal and true and good about the United States. And this is something which is seen in the way that we are still telling stories about JFK and wondering about what he was like and what his family life was like half a century after his death. So this kind of relationship between facts and the invention of stories that are not necessarily belonging to the facts is a really important part of national culture. So my last task for you is to think about wherever you're from, what are some of your national myths? What are the invented traditions that you know about?